Well, thank you very much for having me. And I think probably best to just start with kind of a quick bullet points version of my proof of heaven story. I mean, that's the title in the United States. It was not a title I chose at all. In fact, I recoiled when the publisher came up with that title. I said, that's ridiculous. There's no such thing as proof in science, only in mathematics. And likewise, I said, heaven is such a buzzword. But what my story shows very strongly is that the brain is not the producer of consciousness, that consciousness can actually be far grander when liberated from the brain. And that's, I think, the kind of essence of the story. And it has tremendous implications, not only for discussions about afterlife and afterlife phenomena, but also about the reality of the soul, and major implications for all the scientific data that supports reincarnation. Because when you review the scientific evidence for that, there's really no way to come away thinking that reincarnation is not real. We need to understand much more deeply how all this works, the brain-mind relationship. But that's really where my journey, I think, brings a lot to the table. And of course, my NDE resembles the NDEs of thousands of others that are out there on the internet and in books and scientific reports. And by polling, we can tell that, for example, in the United States, probably at least 13 million people have had a near-death experience. So it's an extraordinary number of people. We really need to explain this. And of course, the me before coma, I was a professor or associate professor of neurosurgery at Harvard Medical School, thought I understood something about, hello?
Hello again.
Sorry, I don't know what happened there. But so I guess where I was in my story was talking about how before my coma, I had trained in kind of physicalism and conventional neuroscience, believe the brain creates consciousness. And then what happened in November of 2008 was I found out through personal experience that all of that thinking was completely wrong. And of course, that's why the scientific community takes a major interest in my story. And what I'd like to point out for those who want to dive deeper into all that, there's a medical case report that was written about my medical records, and it came out in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Diseases in September of 2018. And anyone can access that case report if you go to ebenalexander.com, my website, and look at my blog postings and go back to September 2018, and you'll find the blog that refers to that case report and also has a link directly to it. The reason it's important, though, is because those physicians who were not involved in my care got to go much deeper into my medical records than I had gone. And, I talked about some of that in Proof of Heaven and the appendices and all, but they went much deeper. And in fact, they were so shocked by the amount of damage to my brain, as were the peer reviewers at the medical journal, who challenged them and said, well, how do you explain this case? It's absurd. No one gets this sick from gram-negative bacterial meningoencephalitis and then ends up with a full recovery. How do you explain it? And the doctors who wrote up the case report said it's because he had a near-death experience that he was able to have what appears to be a miraculous level of recovery. And I think that's the important part for all of us, because it really shows us, far beyond placebo effect, which is the gold standard in medicine for any new treatment. Placebo effect is an admission of the power of belief, attitude, and thought in the patient and in caregivers that can participate in achieving health or healing. And an NDE like mine is an example kind of a placebo effect on steroids, an extraordinarily over-the-top healing that goes far beyond our understanding. And so those doctors documented very well how my brain was too incapacitated to harbor any kind of mental functioning, dream, hallucination, confabulation. None of those things were possible given the documented damage to my neocortex. And that's why the events that I describe in Proof of Heaven, which should not have happened according to the tenets of modern neuroscience and the role of the neocortex in producing the details of conscious awareness, is so important. And just briefly, for those who have not read the book, it's important to point out that my near-death experience involved a complete amnesia. I had no words, no language, no knowledge of Earth or of humanity or of this universe. Every bit of that was wiped away. That makes it atypical, even though if you score my NDE on the Grayson scale or the Grayson NDE scale, which is commonly used to score NDEs, I get 28 or 29 out of 32 points, which is extremely high. But the only reason I lost points was really from that amnesia, that I couldn't really go through an Eben Alexander life review, even though I saw life reviews in a very real fashion, but it was a very generic sense. And I only figured out in the months after my coma why this empty slate, this kind of erasure of memory and of preconceptions and all that was so important for my journey. But all that said, it all began in what I call the Earthworm's eye view, a very primitive course on responsive realm that seemed to go for ages. I had no memory of anything before that. I had no body awareness at all. So it did seem to go on for a very long time, but I was rescued by this slowly spinning white light that came towards me and opened like a rip in the fabric of that ugly kind of subterranean view up into this brilliant, ultra real gateway valley. And that was really kind of the shocking and amazing level, because that Gateway Valley would be where we reunite with our higher souls, with souls of departed loved ones, go through life reviews and all of that. And what I witnessed in that Gateway Valley, I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, one of millions of other butterflies looping and spiraling in these vast formations. And down below was this very fertile meadow, no sign of any death or decay. I remember all the plant life was dynamic and emergent and growing, flowers, blossoms, buds on trees, every bit of it, this rich, very fertile world. And in that meadow, that lovely meadow, there were thousands of people dancing. And what I called them in my early writings, I said they were souls between lives, because I had a very strong feeling that that's exactly what that was all about. And there was tremendous joy and merriment. And I even remember dogs jumping and children playing and all this festivity. And it was being driven because up above were these swooping orbs of angelic choirs that were emanating chants and anthems and hymns that would just thunder through my awareness. And I remember on that butterfly wing, I was not alone. There was a beautiful young woman. And those who have read my book or seen my other presentations realize she was very crucial in my understanding the reality of this journey. She was my spiritual guide. And her message to me, I think, was the central message I was to bring back to this world. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. You are deeply cared for. And I cannot tell you how comforting that was. I knew I was in a spiritual home that in many ways seemed more familiar and more home than this realm. It was very comforting. And I remember at that point, this soft summer breeze blowing through. That was my first awareness of the divine, because all of my religious preconceptions and all that were gone. They'd been deleted before the journey. And that was to help me to really come into full fruition on this particular journey. And I remember then that those angelic choirs above provided yet another portal, kind of a wormhole. And I remember all of that the lowest kind of material realm, four-dimensional space-time collapsing down. And all of that spiritual realm of the Gateway Valley with all of its kind of perfection, like the world of ideals, and a different causality ordered up in what I call deep time, which might parallel our earthly time, but our earthly time is here to support the drama unfolding as we're in these material bodies and living these lives. But deep time gives us that alternate perspective, a much more primordial perspective of the evolution of consciousness, kind of the evolution of the soul through multiple lifetimes. And that was where I had these visions as these angelic choirs provided this portal, and all of this was collapsing down until it was all this complex oversphere. And I was in a realm that I call the core. And the core was infinite inky blackness, but filled to overflowing with the infinite healing power of love. And in so many ways, the core was oneness with the divine, oneness with that God force. I came to see that force itself of God or Allah, Brahman, Vishnu, Jehovah. I don't care what words you use, Great Spirit. It's all talking about the same origin of our conscious awareness and that source. And that's what I became one with there. And that's around the core where all dualities are completely resolved. And in fact, I often refer to it as a dazzling darkness, a brilliant light, but combined with a deep pitch black cold dark in a way that makes perfect sense. And the words don't even make sense to talk about it here. But that's why I encourage meditation and encourage sharing these stories, because other people can get to that same level. And what would then happen in my near-death experience is I would tumble back down to that from this sanctum sanctorum of the divine, the core, all the way back to that earthworm eye view, that primitive, coarse kind of subterranean realm where it all began. And what I quickly learned is by remembering the musical notes of the melody, I could ascend back up through that gateway valley, always reassured by that lovely spiritual guide on the butterfly wing, and then witnessing everything I would see there, and then up again and for more lessons in the core. And this happened multiple times, even though I was told whenever I entered the core, and this was not in language, but in pure conceptual flow, you're not here to stay, you'll be going back. We'll teach you many things. But I'd even come to believe that going back meant just back to the earthworm's eye view. I still had no memory or knowledge of this earthly material realm. But there came a time when they were right. And in fact, I tried to conjure up through remembering the musical notes of the melody that portal that led me up into the Gateway Valley, and it didn't come. And to say I was sad at that moment would be a vast understatement, but I also knew that I could trust that I would be taken care of. I had learned that in my passages through these various spiritual realms. And so it was then that I saw thousands of beings going off around into the distance, and their murmuring energy coming up to me was as welcoming and comforting as the most beautiful aspects of the Gateway Valley and the core realm had been in earlier parts of the journey. And in writing it all up after my coma, I call that the power of prayer, that I was aware of these these beautiful kind of messages of prayer for my safety, for my safe return, and all of that. And then I saw 6 faces that appeared out of the muck. I can remember those faces today as vividly as if the whole thing happened this morning. And those faces would murmur a few words, and then they'd go back into the muck. And I didn't recognize them when I saw them, but hours later, when I came back to this world, I recognized exactly who they were. And they helped because they provided what's called veridical time anchors that proved that the vast majority of my coma journey had to happen between days 1 and 5 of my coma. And that's important because, as the case report doctors pointed out, my Glasgow coma scale during that period of days 1 to 5 was down around 6 or 7 or as low as 5. Now, the Glasgow coma scale, anything below 9 is deep coma. So I was in a very deep coma the whole time. And that's important because of the CT and MRI evidence on my scan showing that all 8 lobes of my brain were affected. But when you put this whole package together, it shows you I had this extraordinary, ultra real and vividly memorable experience that was far richer than anything I'd ever had in my life before. And it all happened at a time when my brain was horribly dismantled by this bacterial infection that was destroying all 8 lobes of my brain. And that's when, I came back to this world. It was the 6th face that I saw, as I describe in the book, Proof of Heaven. That 6th face was my 10-year-old son, Bond. What an appropriate name that is. And Bond they protected him from the worst news during that week. But on that Sunday morning, day 7 of coma, when the doctors were holding a family conference saying it was time to stop the antibiotics because there was no hope for any recovery and only a 2% chance of survival, that's when Bond overheard that discussion, ran into my room. My eyes were taped shut. I was on the ventilator, as I had been for 7 days. He pulled open my eyelids, one eye looking up there, one eye over there, both pupils unreactive. Those of you in medicine know that's a horrible thing. And I promise you, I did not hear him with my ears or see him with my eyes, but somehow his pleading with me, Daddy, you're going to be okay, got through to me at those deepest spiritual realms. And that's when I struggled my way back to this world. Initially coming back, my brain was so wrecked, I did not even recognize loved ones at the bedside. It took hours for language to come back, days for a lot of my childhood memories. It took 2 months for a lot of my knowledge and memory to come back. And one of the most astonishing things was that those memories were more complete after they came back than they had been before the coma. And that is something we discuss in detail in our most recent book that was co-written with my partner, Karen Newell, Living in a Mindful Universe. And this is one that we certainly would hope to translate into Swedish before too much longer. It's been translated into many languages. But that's where we really go into the science of all this and how my journey and many other similar experiences, near death, shared death, past life memories in children, suggestive reincarnation, all of these bodies of knowledge scientifically studied can help us get to a much richer version of our understanding of humanity and reality. And that has become my life mission, is to really help this world. And the good news is there are many scientists around the world that I work with. And your coming guest, Bernardo Kastrup, is one of them. And I think I saw that Helene Wabe from IONS is also a recent guest. And that's another set of colleagues at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. And of course, we work with a lot of the scientists at the University of Virginia. If people go to uvadops.org, you will find a lot of their work supporting the scientific basis for non-local consciousness, consciousness independent of the brain, and all of the support and research for the afterlife based on near-death and shared-death experiences, and for reincarnation. So there's a tremendous amount of kind of scientific revolution going on now, in some ways still behind the scenes, because the lay press and media, the science writers are still way too skittish and too kind of mired down in, a demoted view of reality, Newtonian determinism, that seems to hang up a lot of scientists. They just haven't really figured out how quantum physics completely changes the game in terms of our understanding of the nature of reality. And what quantum physics teaches us is none of this is independent of the observer. Every bit of our consciousness depends tremendously on the filtering mechanisms of the brain and really the primacy of mind. And that's where gleaning a greater information and ability to influence the outcome, which, for example, the dramatic, miraculous healing that you can see in near-death experiences is just an example of what can be available to us as we explore much more deeply this kind of intersection of mind and its influence over matter. And that's why I think all of this is really so important to discuss.
Yes, I can really agree. I recognize most of the things you mentioned, and I'm just amazed how big change these experiences indicate, and what people are not at all aware of these experiences. And it's quite a challenge, both for normal people, but especially for trained scientists. They don't realize that they are physicalists, etc., and must realize that consciousness seems to be something else. But what can it be? There are so many steps ahead for them.
Well, it's interesting. The brain and mind are extremely good at convincing us that that world out there is a physical reality that's independent of us. But that is, this profound lesson coming out of modern neuroscience, modern philosophy of mind, quantum physics, especially all the evidence for non-local consciousness in parapsychology, telepathy, which I think you have studied in detail, precognition, presentiment, the fact that we can know the future, seconds or sometimes longer in advance. All the mysteries of what's called retrocausality, the fact that the future in many ways can influence the present. The American Institute of Physics has held 3 major conferences in the last 10 years on quantum retrocausality. And yet that is something that most scientists are completely clueless about. They have no idea what revolution is going on in the scientific community around consciousness. And this is why it's so important to continue doing this work, studying these kinds of experiences, and start understanding more deeply the nature of reality and how much power we have in manifesting free will. In fact, a materialist scientist in many cases will try and argue there's no such thing as free will. They want you to believe everything is predetermined, that we're automatons. It's all just chemistry and electron fluxes and the substance of the brain giving an illusion of consciousness. And they couldn't be further from the truth. And this is a very dangerous time for humanity to kind of carry through with thinking that we have no free will and our choices don't matter. Because that's exactly the deep truth that is coming out of the modern science of consciousness, is our free will matters tremendously, and our choices will determine the future of all humanity. And the more we understand that process and can take ownership and gain agency in our actions and thoughts and how we live with each other, that is really what is going to rescue this world from the mindless, bleak, and paltry fiction of materialism that pretends that the brain creates consciousness and our existence is nothing more than birth to death, and especially the erroneous thinking that we have no free will.
No, really. I think one of the persons listening will have been involved in a project about free will. So I know that's a special topic, free will. One thing I'm a little thrilled about is that you get almost spiritual conclusions from scientific research. That's a big contrast. How can you? That's a challenge to realize that it is scientific research that gives you a spiritual worldview.
Well, I think that's actually to me, I'm very optimistic about that fact. That's a beautiful observation. Religious systems, in many ways, where the science is going on this is a notion of one mind, one consciousness, the binding force of love, how we're all in this together. And of course, that sounds like a religious message. Religions have had thousands of years to try and teach us that deep truth. And yet, because of various conflicts of scripture and orthodoxy and all that, they've been somewhat confused and conflicted over it. And yet, I think these days, what you're finding is many people are finding comfort in claiming to be spiritual but not religious. Now, I'm not I'm not making any negative statements about religion, because I think at the deepest core, all of the major great faiths, based on the messages from the prophets, agree on oneness, love, kindness, compassion, mercy. I mean, these concepts emerge from the depths of religious thinking, and they're exactly what emerges from the depths of the scientific revolution in consciousness now. We should not be surprised that as you get closer to some fundamental truths about the universe, that there's not a convergence in kind of the basic underlying ideas. And that's why I think so many people in the current era are really growing into this. I mean, from my point of view, the more any religion will really hew very close to the message of the prophets about oneness, love, kindness, compassion, mercy, good, great, run with it. And that's all consistent with a modern emerging science. The problem with religions, of course, is when they start to generate tremendous conflict, friction, disagreement, warfare. I mean, all that kind of stuff is absolute madness. Has nothing to do with their original message. And yet when people try to control people, which they will do sometimes through religion, that's where all the trouble comes in. And that's where I'm optimistic, because just as you say, what we're discovering in this deep and profound scientific truth that we're through deeply investigating brain, mind, and all of human experience, and not just saying, well, the stuff we can't explain is off limits. The stuff we cannot explain is actually the clues that lead us towards deeper truth. We've been misled by the low-hanging fruit of materialist investigations into denying a lot of these experiences. And yet the experiences are what give us the key to a deeper understanding. And that's where I think, because it's scientific, science, now the scientific community might be flawed, as are humans, but the scientific method is not. And we can use that to get to objective information. Now, another thing that's important to point out, though, is at the current level of investigation, much of this information is based on, anecdotes, on individual experiences reported by, millions of people, but it's individual experiences. And it's tough to set it all up as a scientific experiment. But I'll remind you of what Richard Feynman said. He was a renowned quantum physicist, won the Nobel Prize, I think, in 1962. And in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, he said, there's a tremendous amount of truth that we can come to know that will never be proven. And what he was stating is that there, especially around consciousness, there is a lot that is very, very challenging to try and set up in a scientific experiment. And yet, if we pay attention to nature's experiments, that is, these experiences that people have and discuss and share and study, and if we look at the commonalities there, that provides us with a tremendous amount of scientific information in how to proceed forward in our understanding. And that's where we go in our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, which is all about the science. In fact, recently, some of the three big books coming out of University of Virginia, Ed Kelly, which is one of the most foremost groups in the world scientifically studying consciousness. And the third book in Ed Kelly's trilogy is called Consciousness Unbound. It just came out in the spring of this year. And I'm actually the cover endorser for that book. And on that cover endorsement, I say sufficiently advanced science and spirituality strengthen each other. And that magnum opus, the book by Ed Kelly, is the way forward. And that's absolutely, as you said in opening this question, spirituality is a very kind of comforting reality of our universe that's perfectly consistent with the science of consciousness. There's no reason to run away from it. It's simply something that helps us come into more fully being human beings. And that's where I think also, because of the scientific support for this revolution, this is the way forward for all of humanity.
You mentioned Edward Kelly. I saw him on a seminar 2 weeks ago, I think, with John Cleese. Mm-hmm. So I made contact with Edward, and they have agreed to try to do a digital thing in February. Both
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a beautiful conference. And Ed Kelly and the whole group at uvadops.org, they really know what they're talking about. That's an excellent resource for anybody who wants to learn a tremendous amount more about this, is uvadops.org.
Yeah. One question before we check the chat questions. This change of paradigm is, I think, very big. Has there been any other change of paradigm during the last centuries that is in the degree of this one? I mean, both physics, psychology, and even theology and ontology.
Well, it truly is of monumental, epic proportions. I mean, people often talk about the Copernican revolution as being a major shift in human understanding, where we went from thinking the Earth was the center of the universe to thinking the sun was the center of the universe. But I would say this one is quite a bit bigger than that. But also remember, this one is very consistent with some of the deepest and most profound lessons coming out of spiritual teachers and prophets going back thousands of years. So in many ways, science and humanity at large is just finally catching up with something that deep thinkers and experiencers of the various spiritual traditions, East and West, have come to realize millennia ago. So let's not be too congratulatory of ourselves yet, because we have yet to rise above and beyond where those brilliant thinkers and experiencers and prophets took us in the first place. But it's just high time that humanity at large wake up to this, because in so many ways, our modern civilization, we call ourselves Homo sapiens. Sapiens means wise. And yes, the advances of scientific materialism in the 20th and early 21st century, medical advances, communication, transportation. I mean, all these things are beautiful, but look at the ugly underbelly Look at our addiction to fossil fuels and carbon dioxide, and how we're already going off the edge of the cliff in terms of global warming and climate change, and all the toxic pollution and that gyre of plastic twice the size of Texas floating in the East Pacific. So there's an ugly underbelly to our materialist scientific successes. And that's where our spirituality and our sense of oneness and a sense of agency and a sense of taking care of ourselves and of future generations is so important. That's why this awakening is happening now. And that's something Karen and I go into in great detail in Living in a Mindful Universe, that this shift, this paradigm shift is absolutely essential. And it's not just Homo sapiens that would go extinct. There are more than 35,000 animal species now that are basically close to extinction. Something like 40% of plant species. Think about how criminal it is that Homo sapiens comes on the scene, starts changing the climate and polluting things over a century or two, and we're in the process of killing off hundreds of millions of years of evolution that gave us this beautiful planet we live on. We really need to, it's an emergency wake-up call, and this awakening is happening none too soon.
I think most of us agree with you. Rasmus, can we try to find any questions from the chat?
Yeah, we have a couple of questions. I'll give them in the order they were asked. So we have a question from Hans Liljenström that goes, how did your science colleagues react to your story? And did any of your materialistic colleagues start to question your worldview?
Well, I think it's important to point out, when I first came back from this, I was my own worst skeptic. When I first came back, as I said, my brain was really scrambled. I didn't even recognize loved ones initially. But then things did start coming back, and I wanted to tell everyone about what I'd experienced, this beautiful experience. But my doctors, for one thing, they were shocked I was even coming back to this world. They thought I had 2% chance of survival, no chance of recovery. And so they were mystified, and they would just say, well, the dying brain plays all kinds of tricks, so you can forget about it. And so I thought, well, vast hallucination. It was way too real to be real. So to me, I thought must be hallucination. But then going back to the hospital over the next few months, reviewing medical records, talking over with doctors, finding out how just ill I was and how badly damaged my neocortex was, I was thinking, well, wait a minute. Where did this thing happen? It could not have happened in my brain. My brain was far too damaged. Now, I will tell you, and in Living in a Mindful Universe, we talk about very specific responses of my physician colleagues. My colleagues at the hospital where I'd worked and where I was hospitalized with coma invited me to give a talk to the entire county medical society on my experience. They wanted to know much, much more. And I found that there's scientists around the world who were totally supportive of this. In fact, to this day, Karen and I hear from engineers, chemists, physicists, doctors, nurses, people trained in the sciences all the time who are very grateful that we're basically taking the discussion to the next level, because the materialist answers were a dead end. They were going nowhere. Look at GalileoCommission.org. That's a group. I'm one of the 100+ scientific advisors on that group. There are more than 300 scientific signees to the Galileo Commission document on the reality of primacy of consciousness. This is a scientific revolution with tremendous scientific support. There are the occasional materialist scientists out there who still don't have a clue about consciousness, who are basically Newtonian determinists, who believe that materialism is true, brain creates consciousness. And they might make a little bit of noise trying to protest against my message and what so many people like me are saying, but it's little more than noise. They have nothing to contribute to the discussion overall. There's a far grander discussion going on in scientific circles of quantum-informed consciousness that really have a lot to say, and that's where this is all going. So to answer the question, there were a few refuting voices here and there, but they're generally people who have ignored the advances in science of the last 80 to 100 years. Their voices have no importance at all in this discussion.
You. Next question is from a user that wants to be anonymous, and the question goes like this. How long do you think it will take before the everyday person embraces this new worldview?
Well, I think that the everyday person can pick up on this very quickly. Actually, that's why we wrote Living in a Mindful Universe. It's written for, every man, not for the scientific mind. And I think it can be very useful. That's a starting point, or just go to ebenalexander.com, explore my reading list, some of the interviews, some of the presentations, and you'll find very quickly that there's a lot that hello.
Hello again. Hello again.
Oh, sorry, I don't know what. I guess that's my internet connection, but it's been stable as a rock for months. I don't know why it would be misbehaving right now, but very sorry I got cut off a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Should I get back into where I was in my answer, or?
Do you remember?
I remember there was a question about, the average person and how they can kind of participate and understand all this.
Yeah.
And I don't know how much I got through in my response, but I mean, essentially what I was saying is, for example, our book, Living in a Mindful Universe, is written for the common man. So I think there's plenty that the average person in the street can understand about this that will make sense and help them get to that deeper level. And again, the most important thing, and this is also a deep part of our book, is that meditation is a way that people can start to have experiences that help them kind of build an understanding, like people who have had near death and shared death and other spiritually transformative experiences. So if you start exploring mind, especially with this kind of knowledge, you can make a lot of progress. And I think the other point, I don't know if it came through before I got cut off, but I was saying how so many of us tend to view that voice in our head, that running stream of thoughts, as who we are. And we treat that as, our consciousness. And in point of fact, I love how Michael Singer, in his book, The Untethered Soul, he calls the running stream of thoughts in our head our annoying roommate. And that's a very good way of putting it, because that is not your consciousness. The little voice in your head is little more than a parlor trick. And there's much deeper wisdom available as we traverse that veil and start to become much more comfortable with the grander aspects of self that we can access through meditation. And that's why I'm a tremendous proponent of meditation. I think we can get a lot closer to these deep truths there than, for example, using psychedelic substances, for example, that some people try and use to get, through the veil to deeper spiritual territory. But I would strongly, strongly urge people to go with meditation. I think you can get a much more powerful connection, much cleaner information flow through meditation than through trying to use various substances.
Very good. Very good. Yes. Okay, Rasmus.
Yeah. This next question is from Thomas Wiedegård, and I think you've already touched on this, but maybe in the last answer, but maybe you can you have some more insights. And it says, imagine if your view of consciousness would be accepted by science and by the general opinion, how would that change the world?
Well, it'll change the world dramatically, because one of the most fundamental kind of lessons of this awakening in the scientific community about the brain-mind connection, about consciousness, is that we're all really in this together. We truly, if you hurt another, you're hurting yourself. In many ways, through near-death experiences and the life review is very commonly encountered. More than half of people report it. And in the life review, one of the most interesting things is you experience the events of your life, not from your own perspective, but from the emotional perspective of those around you. So in many ways, the life review is showing that the golden rule, treat others as you would like to be treated, is written into the very fabric of the universe. And that's one of the deepest and most profound lessons coming from all this. It's one that, the founders of quantum physics saw very clearly. They saw one mind. They saw that consciousness seems to be uniform and seems to be, pervading the universe. This level of what's called the mental realm, in many ways, is really just a spiritual realm. And that's really the profound lesson, because NDEers come back to this world in huge numbers, talking about how we need to show more kindness and compassion for each other. And it's not just about human beings. This lesson extends to our animal and plant friends in this world. So it's important to kind of get this bigger picture that we're spiritual beings in a spiritual universe, which ultimately means we're all connected in a very deep and real sense. And in that, we also have a shared purpose and mission. And that is really to provide, true stewardship of this planet. In all the decisions we make, try to foster sustainability and foster approaches where we're no longer slave to corporate greed, where corporations can run roughshod over the population and pollute the planet. We really need to take charge of this. And that, I think, is why this kind of revolution is so important to get out to the world, is it brings much more of a sense of unity and synthesis and shared purpose.
Okay, yes.
Thank you. This next question is from, and I'm truly sorry if I mispronounced it, Andrew Shea, and he asks, are you familiar with the book An Atheist in Heaven, The Ultimate Evidence for Life After Death by Paul Davids and Gary E. Schwartz? And if so, can we trust the authors?
Well, I've seen the title, I've not read the book, but if Gary Schwartz is involved in it, if he wrote a foreword or something like that, I would say yes, absolutely. Gary Schwartz has done a lot of work in this field. And so I would say, yes, you can trust the authors. Without having read the book, I can't comment further.
Thank you. The next question we have is from Anne-Sophie, and she asks, how do you understand the earthworm eye view state that you were in?
Well, initially when I came back to this world, I felt the earthworm eye view was basically the best consciousness that my physical brain could muster when it was soaking in pus in this extremely deadly and should have killed me bacterial meningoencephalitis. But of course, I had never read the near-death literature before. I'd never read things like the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And so what I came to realize is that, in fact, the level I went through, that earthworm eye view, very primitive and coarse and kind of unresponsive realm, is commonly encountered. And in fact, it would be kind of like the Bardo state in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. So many people, I think, can pass through that level on their way to the higher levels. But I no longer have that simplistic initial view of what the earthworm's eye view was. The other thing I'd point out is if I had just gone to the earthworm's eye view and come back to this world, I would have had a hellish near-death experience. The hellish are very kind of frightening NDEs. They occur in probably somewhere between 3 and 5% of all reported NDEs, although I think that's probably a low estimate because people would be less likely to share such a negative experience. But the important thing to point out is that even those negative NDEs can have a very positive effect in transforming someone, just as do the positive NDEs. So I think different souls need different lessons and different ways that those lessons are presented. And that's why you do have even a few that are unpleasant. But for the rest of us, it should be very reassuring that the vast majority of NDEs are very comforting. In fact, people often complain if they're kind of resuscitated back into this body, they were enjoying their transition to the spiritual realm so much that they're sometimes angry with their resuscitators. I know Pim van Lommel from the Netherlands, who wrote that beautiful book, Consciousness Beyond Life, one of his first resuscitations as an intern way back in the 1960s was that the patient was very distraught that they were brought back to this world because they were enjoying the journey very, very much. And I think that's really the main lesson for all of us, is that generally those worlds of love and of compassion and of acceptance and kind of our true spiritual home is a very comforting experience and not one to be feared.
True. I recognize that. They really love that journey.
Yes.
Yes.
Totally.
Yeah.
Thank you. Our next question is from Jenny Elevall, and she asks, can you recommend or are you connected to any particular meditation groups in Stockholm or some other part of Scandinavia? Do you have any online meditation groups or sessions?
Well, I cannot recommend any specific group in Scandinavia. I mean, my own personal pattern of meditation is one that we've shared widely in our workshops that we've given around the world. And that's both physical workshops where we would travel and share. And then also in the COVID pandemic, we've done a lot of webinars. But basically, the key to getting to that meditation is to visit sacredacoustics.com. Now, truth be told, Sacred Acoustics is the co-founder of that group is my partner, Karen Newell. She's the co-author of the book, Living in a Mindful Universe. But in fact, I was the one who urged Karen and her business partner, Kevin, to get together and to make a company to actually make their tones available to the world. The tones are a form of binaural beat brainwave entrainment. And binaural beats are a very powerful way of kind of liberating consciousness from the shackles of the physical brain and from this kind of mythical view of ourselves as being in these bodies and just a body that's here birth to death and nothing more. So to traverse that veil, Sacred Acoustics can be a very powerful technique. And in fact, there was a pilot study that's now been published in the peer-reviewed medical literature assessing the use of Sacred Acoustics. It was done mainly in the treatment of anxiety and depression in a very busy New York City psychiatric practice. That case report, that pilot study was published in the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease in February of 2020. And it was by Dr. Anna Yusim, Y-U-S-I-M. And it goes a long way. In fact, they said that just listening to Sacred Acoustics tones for 2 weeks led to a 26% reduction in anxiety symptoms in their patients, compared to only a 7% reduction in those who had talk therapy, standard psychotherapy for anxiety. So a very powerful result over only 2 weeks. That pilot study in itself would argue strongly for the use of Sacred Acoustics. And I'd also point out that binaural beats have been found generically to be very powerful at enhancing out-of-body experiences and remote viewing. Remote viewing is the scientifically studied form. Many people know it as the psychic spy programs, things like that. But the ability to discern information at a distance and through time, as shown by very experienced remote viewers, and people in the late 20th century found that binaural beat brainwave entrainment was a very powerful way to enhance remote viewing. We talk about it in great detail in Living in a Mindful Universe, especially about how it works, we believe, by using sound manipulation of circuits in the lower brainstem. These are very ancient circuits that arose more than 300 million years ago. And given that most sounds you've ever heard that might have been associated with a transcendental experience, like chants or anthems or hymns, those are all processed in circuits up in the neocortex, in the acoustic lobes, in circuits that have basically evolved in the last few million years in humans and in primates. But that's why I believe binaural beat brainwave entrainment is so much more powerful, is it's actually influencing circuits way down in the lower brainstem that are far more ancient. And that's why I believe it plays such a tremendous role in liberating people's conscious awareness through the veil and the filtering function of the brain. So just go to sacredacoustics.com to learn a lot more.
Okay, quite interesting. Yeah.
Thank you. I left a link to Sacred Acoustics and to your
Thank you.
website.
And also important to note, you listen best through headphones. It's by splitting the channels to the two ears that you get the best effect. They can have some effect through speakers, but it's much better with headphones or earbuds.
Okay, yes.
Great advice. Our next question is from Agent Parker, and he asks, you said that philosophically you are an idealist. How do you reconcile this with your concern about the environment and the physical world?
Well, I think idealism is absolutely perfect. That leads us into the next level of human evolution, where we actually have a very healthy planet, the power of mind over matter. And that's what I think we all have to participate in, is realize that our mind and our kind of mental influence and our kind of mental notions of what is possible and what is best for the world are things that can translate into our evolving reality. Now, I'm talking about this mainly from the philosophical position of the mind-brain relationship. And in fact, there's tremendous evidence supporting that whole line of inquiry. But every bit of it supports the notion of free will, and that in fact, we do have a tremendous say in the emerging reality of this planet. But that involves raising our consciousness. And that's what all of us can participate in. It doesn't take, everyone doing this to be successful. In fact, there were studies, for example, with transcendental meditation way back in the mid and late 20th century, showing that if only 3% of the population in a given community is meditating, it can often have very profound beneficial effects on the community at large. But I think the more of us that participate and the more of us who hold these high mental images of the future of mankind and hold to, very sorry, I think this must be some problem with my internet that I haven't had for months, but I'm sorry for the frustration. I'm sure it's frustrating for you all, but I'm thinking maybe if you have any other questions, I can try and answer them, but other than that.
Yeah, we can hope that it's. We don't know what it is, but we can hope that the energy is with us now.
Yes, we can hope.
I think there were 2 or 3 more questions. We will see if we can take them too.
Yeah, there were 3 questions left, so we can try and get through them. And again, sorry if I don't say this correctly, but Heine Peters asks, man is made out of several consciousnesses, emotional, mental, and casual. Did you experience any difference between them when you went back and forth to the physical realm, I guess?
And I'm sorry, I missed the question part of that.
If you experience any difference between the different kinds of consciousnesses.
Well, I think so, but one thing I've learned in all this, you can either define and limit and kind of try and layer everything out in as fine detail as you want, but I think that actually leads us away from the truth. So I tend to be more of a lumper than a splitter when it comes to consciousness, and I think ultimately there are ways that you can define the various levels. In this world, in these bodies, we have both a kind of a conscious awareness and also the unconscious, which plays a tremendous role. But those are both part of kind of the deeper level of consciousness of what we all are and who we all are. And yet then in meditation, I've often come to recognize the kind of purity and real existence of that primordial mind, of that higher soul aspect. So I think that the language can be a little confusing, and I'm not sure that we yet have the best definitions, but I think there are definitely, various levels of consciousness that any human being can experience. And we talk about that a little bit in Living in a Mindful Universe, but I tend to kind of group it all more together under the various kind of levels that a soul can encounter, and manifest in its own journey between material realms and spiritual realms, and between lives and all that kind of thing. So hopefully that helps without muddying the water too much. I'm more of a lumper than a splitter.
Yes.
Thank you. This question is from Jan Fjellander. How did this experience change your relationship with your nearest family members?
Well, I'd say it in many ways has brought me even closer to them. That I thought I was very close before. I can tell you my sons, both my sons have gotten very interested in kind of meditation and consciousness. They pay a lot of attention to this. And I would say a lot of my kind of close family and friends have really just remarked on what a positive change this experience has had in me. It's one where I feel my intuition, my sense of empathy is far grander than it was before, because I've seen that unity of consciousness, that beautiful sense of the binding force of love that truly brings us all together. And I think in many ways that's affected the way I interact with those close to me, and vice versa.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Here we go. Next question. I wonder if you experienced if you are your life force, or if the life force is a tool for making all levels of you come together, from an anonymous user.
I'm sorry, part of that broke up on me. The question again?
This is from an anonymous user that said, I wonder if you experienced that you are your life force, or if the life force is a tool making all of your levels going together or come together.
Well, I tend to use different language than life force. It's more about the soul and kind of the spirit, and soul are the various kind of viscous strands of spirit. But it's really all unified through a soul journey that involves, in fact, the way I saw life reviews and reincarnation in my journey, given that I had no personal memories of Eben Alexander's life, was I saw this rich tapestry. It's what I call the Indra's net vision that I had in the core realm. But it was this beautiful tapestry of all these interwoven threads. But what I saw was that each thread was a soul line through multiple lifetimes of learning and teaching lessons, with the adjacent threads, all of this a process of growth, basically the evolution of all consciousness, as Pierre Teilhard de Chardin reported in his book, The Phenomenon of Man in the mid-20th Century. I believe that's really what's going on here. We're all contributing to the evolution of consciousness through this kind of dance of the learning and teaching and the interwoven threads of our existence. So for me, it's much more than just a life force. It's really looking at that soul line and this kind of collective journey of evolving beings. In many ways, we're sharing the dream of the one mind. But the one mind is in a process of transformation and growth. That's why when in this context we talk about reincarnation, it's not simply a blind mechanistic wheel that you're trying to get off of, but it's one that in many ways is filled with grace and with the concept of growth and transformation and evolution. And I believe that's exactly what's happening, but it comes in the form of individual sentient beings going through these lifetimes and progressing towards that oneness with the divine over multiple incarnations.
Thank you. And I've seen there's come some more questions, but I don't know. I've seen your connection seems a bit unstable again. So maybe we should call it a night here. What do you say?
Yeah, my apologies. I think my internet, I haven't seen this kind of behavior in months. I don't know why it's doing this now. But I greatly appreciate your interest in this opportunity to talk with people. You can keep in touch with me through ebenalexander.com, sacredacoustics.com. And also, I would just say that Karen and I did a whole series of interviews with colleagues. It's very interesting, available for free if people go to unitedinhopeandhealing.com. So that's where you can gain access to a series of interviews we've done during the COVID pandemic with many of the thought leaders in this consciousness movement. And I think your people would find that quite instructive. So thank you very much for having me. I apologize for what appears to be a very naughty and misbehaving internet on my end. It's been a joy talking with all of you, and I hope I've helped to clarify some of these matters.
Absolutely. We all appreciate all your good ideas and experiences. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and blessings to you all.